The summary for urban policymakers brings together the three working groups of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, not just the Sixth Assessment Report itself, but also the special reports that have been within that cycle. And it's, as you would imagine, quite a landmark cycle of science and policy engagement, given the co-production that's embedded within the IPCC. So there are a lot of key themes. I work on the adaptation working group too, and for us themes, well, perhaps the most important theme is the opportunity that urban areas present, a time-limited opportunity to adapt to climate change through rapid urban growth over the next 20 years, and the warning that if we don't embed adaptation in the new build infrastructure, in the new build housing, and in the organizational forms through which that adaptation and inclusive structures of urban life will be built, that we will be setting ourselves up for much greater climate risk in the relatively near term. Two key takeaways from the SUP from an adaptation perspective are the adaptation gap, the urban adaptation gap, and climate resilient development from an urban perspective. These are both quite well detailed in the Sixth Assessment Report and indeed in supplementary material. But in the SUP, these points really come to the fore. It's really a great way of communicating with policymakers the ways in which adaptation is limited and therefore might be prioritized. So the adaptation gap really says very clearly that we are not yet in any world region to any of the immediate threats of climate change, so rainfall flooding, coastal flooding, or temperature extremes. We are not yet adapted even to existing levels of risk. That is the adaptation gap. It's greatest in all regions for all hazards for the urban poor. And that gap recedes, but is not overcome if one moves from deployed adaptation through to planned adaptation, through to conceivable adaptation. So even for all conceivable adaptation, we are not able to meet the adaptation needs today of the urban poor in particular, which tells us a lot about the governance mechanisms as much as the technology opportunities to cities. So that's a key message. It defines something of the opportunity space that we need to act quickly, and ties adaptation and the possibilities of adaptation very tightly to climate mitigation. Without climate mitigation, it's very clear we will not be able to meet that adaptation gap, the risk gap. Climate resilient development also talks to mitigation very squarely. It's the ambition that adaptation actions should not only be thought of as successful if they develop adaptation at the project level. For example, a retaining wall might stop slope movement, but it asks of any infrastructure, large and small, what are the consequences of that adaptive action for risk management more broadly, for mitigation more broadly, and for sustainable development. There's limited literature on that. There's enough to say that there are many opportunities for moving towards a climate resilient development. The work that we have already suggests there's real opportunity, particularly around integrated planning, thinking around hybrid solutions, how one could bring social policy, physical infrastructure, nature-based solutions together, perhaps not in the same space necessarily, but as overlapping responses to the complex risks that come from climate change, which point to really thinking in a structured, strategic, programmatic level about adaptation in the city. So from a simple way of reframing what a successful adaptation might look like, climate resilient development takes us into a very specific argument around the ways in which adaptation can be deployed and financed and acted upon in the city.